Much like the definition of science fiction, I believe it will forever be impossible to pinpoint exactly when the genre was born. It's an art form that spontaneously emerged from ancient human history. The tales of Gilgamesh, the epics of Homer, and the musings of Aristophanes consider the concept of immortality and the idea of travelling to other realms and meeting other life forms as far back as the 2nd millennium BC. But for my money, the first recognisable as such science fiction story was A True Story by the Syrian satirist Lucian of Samosata around 2,000 years ago. A sailing ship travels to the moon, gets embroiled in an interplanetary war, there's a first contact event, and there's even advanced technology on display. Sounds like science fiction to me. However, we have to wait until the early 19th century until we see a true rock star of the genre. A novel that creates something fantastical using the application of fictional science, inspiring the writers that inspired the movement. Science fiction has arrived. Enter Frankenstein. I think we can justify the 6-hour round trip for 30 seconds of footage to pay our respects to the lady that gave us the modern Prometheus of something that I live and breathe every day. And we couldn't afford to go to Geneva. Yeah. Mary Shelley's seminal work not only explored the ramifications of scientific experimentation, but also themes relating to the nature of humanity and the impact of isolation on the psyche. By delving into these multifaceted concepts, she forged a path for future science fiction writers to expand upon and reflect on the moral and ethical implications of scientific advancement and human progress. She straddled the Gothic, the Romantic, and the Enlightenment, while simultaneously rejecting the progressive ideals of her own generation. This is a deeply complicated book. It may be the iconic imagery of the monster from the 1931 film that lingers more prominently than the book itself. But without Frankenstein, I don't think science fiction has quite the same flavour. What Shelley did here echoes through everything after.
I have love in me, the likes of which you can scarcely imagine, and rage, the likes of which you would not believe. If I cannot satisfy the one, I will indulge the other.
Science fiction has made a breakthrough, but it's still laying the foundations for the future. Shelley deals with the human reflection and the metaphorical aspect, but where's the technology and the adventure? The Industrial Revolution forever changed the lives, the politics, the aesthetic, and the vision of the Western world. This is the era of great scientific progress, a new landscape of discovery. This is the era of Jules Verne. Verne would probably be a bit reluctant to be called one of the grandparents of science fiction. His writing had all of the components, the science and the fiction, but in spirit he was celebrating the beauty of the world and beyond. He states that in his early novel, 5 Weeks in a Balloon, he wanted to write about the majesty of Africa, the geography, the people, and the history. The balloon was just the method to move through the story. More extraordinary voyages required a leap in technology to actually get us there. A submarine to 20,000 leagues under the sea, a flame-resistant raft to the centre of the Earth, and of course, a giant cannon to shoot astronauts from the Earth to the moon. Think of it this way, as the Victorian-era scientists were blowing our minds with new discoveries, Verne was one step ahead, artistically speaking, saying, yeah, that's nice, but what's over the horizon? As Ray Bradbury put it, we are all, in one way or another, the children of Jules Verne. Bonsoir. Dare I say that everything up until this point will pale in comparison to the true pivot point of the origins of science fiction. 5,000 years of culture and storytelling lead to one man. He may not have been the first or even the best, but science fiction would simply be a different thing, a poorer place, without the one and only H.G. Wells. For many people, this is the true dawn of science fiction literature. Wells didn't invent the ideas of alien invasion, invisibility, time travel, or genetic manipulation, but he did popularise and explore the genre like nobody else before. He often explained the scientific method within the text, a proto-hard science fiction trait, rather than obscuring the technology behind a wall of ambiguity and hand-waving. He also went deep into the mind and the consequences of playing God. The Invisible Man is as much about madness, violence, and the dark ego as it is about inventing something awesome. But maybe more importantly, he was a bit of a rebel, an antagonizer who used plenty of social commentary within these fantastic stories, making the plot just one part of the overall experience. The world is entering a new century, a time of massive change for good and ill. Wells is perfectly placed at the crossroads of history and leaves his mark on the future.
We all have our time machines, don't we? Those that take us back are memories, and those that carry us forward are dreams.
Depending on definition, science fiction has many origins and tributaries, but this is only the beginning. The world is about to explode. Come with us to the Golden Age. The early 20th century saw the old world pass the science fiction baton to the Americans. Cheap paper, a plethora of willing writers, and the vision of one man gave birth to the era of the pulps. Hugo Gernsback launched Amazing Stories in 1926, a monthly magazine devoted solely to science fiction. More pulps followed, including Astounding Stories, which led to the Golden Age. It's generally agreed that the Golden Age of science fiction started in 1938 when John W. Campbell took charge of Astounding Stories. He then pretty much single-handedly changed the look and feel of science fiction for an entire generation. Did the Golden Age ever really end, or did it get swept away by the new wave in the 60s? One thing's for certain is that the legacy and the influence remain to this day. This was a period where every subgenre and nuance of science fiction overflowed with ideas. We owe a great debt to the hundreds, the thousands of authors and editors who made a contribution and set the stage forevermore. I haven't got all day, so I'll just focus on the big three. In case you're wondering who the big three actually are, that's Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, and Arthur C. Clarke. Between them, they sold about 1 million books and short stories. They won all of the awards. They had awards named after them. Why do you think they were called the Big Three? It's hard to imagine a world without the laws of robotics, Starship Troopers, and I'm sorry, Dave, I'm afraid I can't do that. But they were so much more than cultural icons. In their own unique ways, they made science fiction self-reflective again, echoing back to the days of Shelley and Wells. For decades, all we got was a distraction. This stuff really made you think. Asimov was the master of giving technology an identity. It really mattered how the science worked and how it affected people. He was an amazing ideas man. Robert Heinlein was complicated. He was a champion of liberty. He evolved over his career probably more than any other science fiction author. He wrote stories for children. He poked at politics. He had a lot of sexy fun time. And then he got really weird. Arthur C. Clarke was the wordsmith of the three. He was the one that pushed the genre the furthest. He was the one that transcended the science into a deeper concept. He went out there. We're not saying that you should only read these three authors, of course not, but they do form a formidable foundation of the identity of science fiction in the 20th century.
Intelligent life is the only thing that gives meaning to the universe. It is a holy thing to be fostered and treasured. Without it, nothing begins, nothing ends. There can be nothing through all eternity but the mindless babblings of chaos.
This is a video about science fiction. So what brings me to this duck pond in a village in the heart of the English countryside? I wanted to highlight the darker side of the genre. It's always been there, of course. Things from outer space trying to kill us, the world ending in one way or another. I bloody love the end of the world. The approach to this subject shifted after the Second World War across all corners of literature. Oversaturation meant that authors needed to come up with new ideas to get our attention. My favourite example is John Wyndham. Call it the veneer of civilization or the cosy catastrophe, a subgenre about the apocalypse that may not be so bad after all. Ultimately, hopeful stories. I think Wyndham was at his strongest when teasing us with the uncanny, the potential for evil living just under the skin, agitating deep human instincts. His novel, Chalky, is, on the surface, a story about a young boy with a very overactive imagination. Or maybe it's a story about a young boy whose brain gets hijacked by aliens. Or maybe it's a story about a young boy who suffers from a very serious mental illness. His masterpiece, The Midwich Cuckoos, has a similar theme of intrusive aliens with little regard for human welfare, but it also has that tea and crumpets, wave to your neighbour thing going on. And I find that quite disturbing. As we march through the 20th century, it's clear that the time for wondrous adventure and mind-blowing technology will have to share a bed with something much darker. But how dark can it get? The rise of communism and fascism, the spectre of nuclear obliteration, and the notion that a democratic government could turn totalitarian and take away our liberty and identity all contributed to a collective paranoia. The dystopian phenomenon in science fiction wasn't about whether it could possibly happen, but how soon it would happen and which mask would it be wearing. As far back as 1908, Jack London was writing about a dictatorship in America for the good of the people, the Iron Heel. In 1921, Yevgeny Zamyatin's We provided the blueprint for the now familiar extreme surveillance, ultimate control, top-down government system. The most famous dystopian novel of them all, 1984, takes this totalitarian idea to the extreme. There will be no uprising, there is no hope, they will change history and police our thoughts, and you will love it. Big Brother is watching you. This is a golden age of dystopian fiction, but a calamitous version of our real-world future is not so black and white. It's not so good versus evil. Ray Bradbury's masterpiece, Fahrenheit 451, talks about a world of censorship, a population infatuated with mass media, and the dumbing down of society. As if that could ever happen. And Brave New World, my personal favourite, Huxley shows the human race sleepwalking into oblivion. Take these pills and everything will be fine. Condition ourselves to be part of the machine. As if that would ever happen. By the 1960s, there was a whiff of revolution in the air. We hadn't run out of things to write about, far from it, but with the launch of Sputnik in 1957 and Walking on the Moon in '69, it felt like we had reached the ambitions of the Golden Age. Science fiction was about to evolve from outer space to the inner depths of the mind. The old guard would resist, but a new wave was bearing down on us. A wave that would carry us all the way to the modern era. By definition and application, science fiction has always been an experimental genre, but all the way up to the 1960s, it also had a reputation for being somewhat clinical. There was a periphery, of course, but the essence of the pulp era still lingered. The world changed in the 60s, and science fiction changed with it. The engineered ethos of the old school was confronted with the avant-garde, new methods of expression, and literary techniques. The new wave didn't rely on a certain level of technology or a traditional structure of storytelling. Born out of the counterculture, these authors were immune to the limits of space and time. Just as Gernsback and Campbell were the spearhead of the pulps and the Golden Age, Michael Moorcock's editorial stint at New Worlds magazine is considered by many to be the springboard for the new wave. In 1967, the Americans joined in. Harlan Ellison's anthology, Dangerous Visions, tapped into something dark and controversial, but also wildly popular, solidifying the transition to this new realm of thought. The decade that followed was a smorgasbord of sex, drugs, politics, activism, and postmodern navel-gazing. Probably my favourite period in all of science fiction. It's impossible to get bored of this stuff. It wasn't just subversive, wild ideas. There was substance to the style. This was a sophisticated movement comprising the very best science fiction writers of any generation.
You cannot buy the revolution. You cannot make the revolution. You can only be the revolution. It is in your spirit, or it is nowhere.
There is one author who I think bridges the gap to the next phase perfectly, Philip K. Dick. He was a cornerstone of the new wave, but it often felt like he was already a part of the modern era. It may have had a retro vibe, but Dick's vision was one of constructed realities, artificial emotions, and post-new wave ideas. The cyberpunk before cyberpunk. Science fiction was in a weird place at the start of the 80s. Due to the massive success of Star Wars, the mainstream hungered for a very particular brand of sci-fi. The genre was more popular than ever, but the radical was eclipsed by commercial schlock. The traditional story tropes of good versus evil, a predictable hegemony, and simply projecting the current world into the future never felt more exhausted than at this time. However, by the mid-80s, a revolution was underway, spearheaded by William Gibson and epitomised by Neuromancer. It was a shocking wake-up call. Gibson understood that the future had started to lose resolution, and science and culture was about to speed up and transform like never before. We now lived in a digital world. We all had microchips in our homes, driving technology to new heights. Future history was redefined as a technological landscape, with humans piggybacking onto something smarter than us, something new. Of course, this had all been written about in the past, but the 80s was a pivotal point because for the first time, it actually felt like we were living in the future. The potential real-world ramifications were too powerful to ignore. Will the digital age deliver utopia, calamity, or something that we can't yet comprehend? The genre had regained its sense of alienation and was once again full of questions.
He'd operated on an almost permanent adrenaline high, a byproduct of youth and proficiency, jacking into a custom cyberspace deck that projected his disembodied consciousness into the consensual hallucination that was the Matrix.
Science fiction has always been a genre of extrapolating what we currently know, applying imagination to the real world, and asking, what if? But what do we write about when we seem to be surrounded by the future? Where will the new ideas come from? What barriers can we possibly break down? Where is science fiction right now? I think we're standing at a very familiar but magnified crossroads, potentially the most exciting time for science fiction and for our civilization in general. Just in the next decade, we'll be walking on the moon again, James Webb will open our eyes to the secrets of the universe, possibly even detecting alien life, artificial intelligence is about to explode, and quantum computers will change everything. But I also detect a trend of the cynical, the political extremes, this desperately inclusive narrative that's hijacked the mainstream, and of course, climate fiction. Where is science fiction right now? I find it's almost impossible to gauge the zeitgeist, especially when you're right in the thick of it. We can only be aware of and read so many new books, and most of us are still devouring the libraries of history. I'm optimistic. The scene is set for the most diverse, thought-provoking period the world has ever seen, and more people have access to the material than ever before. We have the advantage of nostalgia. We can take history and mould it into anything we want. New space operas, new adventures, new dystopias, a new wave. Or maybe we'll become the ultimate method actors and destroy ourselves, rendering all of these wonderful books utterly pointless. I bloody love the end of the world. With more than a century of amazing stories to explore, we live in a time where, whatever your preferred flavour of science fiction may be, you should never run out of things to read. But if you do get to the end, you could just go back to the beginning.